Lead Time is a podcast of the Unite Leadership Collective, hosted by Tim Allman and Jack Caliberg. Lead Time taps into biblical wisdom for practical solutions to today's burning issues. Each podcast confronts real-time struggles facing the local church in a post-Christian culture. Step into the action with the ULC at uniteleadership.org. This is Lead Time.
Happy day. Welcome to Lead Time. Tim Allman here with Jack Caliberg. I pray wherever you are today that the joy of the Lord is your strength. Jack, how you doing? What's giving you joy right now, brother?
Yeah, giving me joy. Well, this is sound a little counterintuitive, but we had my mother's memorial service this last weekend here, Saturday afternoon. Thank you, Tim, very much. Your eulogy was amazing. It was a real good time of bringing families together. And obviously, my mom was a woman of very strong faith. And so it was a time of sharing her faith and the hope that is found in that faith. And I was really delighted to be able to kind of say that and share that with a lot of friends and family.
Yep.
So that was gave me a lot of hope, even though a sorrowful time with the loss.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have, and it was an honor, man, for sure. Love you and love your family. We have today as our guest, Jack, Patrick Ferry. Reverend Dr. Pat Ferry has been an amazing, I would say epic leader within our church body for many, many years, 35 years of which he guided Concordia, Wisconsin, and then Concordia, Ann Arbor as their president. And I've always been struck, Pat, by the way, I know you're very intelligent, and you can do systems and vision and all that kind of stuff. But just the way, Pat, you relate to people, you're very, very human and accessible. And even in our conversation kicking off today, before we hit play, we were talking about the Broncos, and we share a love for the Denver Broncos, even though they don't love us back right now, Pat. They don't love us back.
That's
at all.
Very, very painful. Very painful time.
It is. Hey, first question, though. I mean, you went to Concordia St. John's College, which was Winfield, Kansas, right?
Right.
You were there, I think, a couple years after my dad, Reverend Dave Allman was there. Sure. The Johnnies, right? Isn't that what you guys were called?
That's right. We weren't Concordia, by the way. We were just St. John's College, but
just a 2-year. We had a number of them within the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, all of which have closed or they moved on and became 4-year institutions. But you went to St. John's not knowing Jesus. Tell us that story.
Yeah, let's get right into that. But St. John's also became a 4-year college for a few years before it closed, and I was in the first 4-year class. I like to boast to people that I was third in my class. There were only 5 of us, but not bad.
That's awesome.
Yeah, no. So and the guy who was number 1 in that class, many of your listeners and viewers will know Reed Lessing. So Reed Lessing's also from Denver. We were kids, grew up together in Wheat Ridge, Colorado, and so I decided to go to St. John's, and then it was only because I had neighbors who were LCMS Lutherans who put me in touch with that place. And I wanted to play basketball in college. That was the only thing that inspired me to move 500 miles from the lovely Rocky Mountains nestled there in Denver, Colorado, to Winfield, Kansas, right in the middle of nowhere. I have to be careful. My wife is from Winfield, so anyway, I talked Reed into going along too, and I don't know how I talked him into it. He was neither of us were Lutherans. I was an unchurched person entirely, but off we went. We were roommates, and I got to play college basketball at St. John's. I didn't, when I went there, I didn't know that I was going to play on the worst team in the history of collegiate sports, worse than the Broncos are now.
Really?
How bad? I'm not kidding you. We were awful. I should have known. It was the only school in all of America that was recruiting me. So, so we were awful, and we lost our first 10 or 11 games before Christmas. I was really thinking about not going back, but then I went back. They were going to have this tournament over January break, and this did include other Concordias, Concordia, Texas, Concordia, Milwaukee, and then this other little school called St. Paul's College, which wasn't a Concordia, but it was located in Concordia, Missouri. That's probably why they didn't want to overly confuse the situation. We really do lack some creativity when it comes to naming our schools. But anyway, so we lost. It was a round robin. We played every team. We lost to Concordia, Texas. I'm living in that neighborhood now. My daughter teaches there. They were pretty good. And then we lost to Concordia, Milwaukee, where I spent so much of my career. They were a good basketball team in those days, and also today we lost both those games handily. But St. Paul's looked just about as bad as us, and that was the third team we played. And we went out there, and at halftime we were leading, and so I think, well, gosh, this is interesting, and we didn't know how to behave in the locker room at halftime. Kind of snapping each other with towels and giggling and all this. Anyway, went out the second half and fell behind, back and forth, and then on a nearly last-second shot by a point guard from Denver, Colorado, who will otherwise remain anonymous, we hit it. We won. And so you might say, well, then you weren't the worst team in the history of collegiate sports because you beat St. Paul's College by 1. But this, just a little bit more of this story. It's a fun story. So anyway, okay. So this was in January, and then we got the bad news right after that game that 4 of the other 5 starters on that team were academically ineligible for the second semester. So not only were we not athletic, we were not particularly bright either, right? So we show up the next game. We have 4 guys, only 4 guys. We go down and then we recruited guys from the dorm, from the concession stand. The guys didn't even play in high school, and then they finished out this season with us, and we played some pretty good teams. I mean, we ended up 1-25, but we lost one game. Just for example, we lost 148-50. We lost by 98 points. Against it was Barton County Community College. Obviously, Well, anyway, it was horrible. The whole thing was just horrible. Horrible experience. I was homesick. It was hard to stay in touch with friends and family in those days. You had to kind of use payphones and write letters, and just was a hassle. And yet, when I think back on it, it was, it certainly didn't take long to realize it was the best and the most important year of my life, because I was in this Lutheran college environment where faith was integrated with learning. And there were other kids who were like me in every other way, but had a dimension in their lives that I was missing in my own. And so I was baptized my freshman year, came to confirmation soon after that. And interestingly, my friend Ree Lessing, who's great, he was a seminary prof, now teaches at Concordia St. Paul, great scholar. He also, was confirmed after that freshman year. And it just, obviously reinforces my keen interest in the importance of Lutheran higher education, where I spent most of my career. But it was, it's a good story. And, I also met my wife there. She came the next year, her dad, John Seleska, Tammy Seleska's my wife. So she, her father was a great spiritual mentor for me for all of the rest of his life, and continues to have deep impression upon me to this day.
Wow,
so Pat,
that's amazing.
Who was speaking to you during this? You said freshman year that you got baptized. Yeah. Who were the people that were speaking to you about the gospel? Was it the professors or the students?
Jack, it was a part of every class. Take John Seleska, for example. I wasn't in church work program, so I had him for psychology, taught psychology. And, he started off teaching us that what it literally means is the study of the spirit, so he integrated faith and learn. I took psychology in high school, Jefferson High School, it was a lot different at St. John's, a lot different. And so it was that. And then, they had chapel every day. I didn't go every day. I admit that once in a while I'd go. And then it was, again, just other students who I don't think many of them were like very intentional about it. They were just kids, freshmen in college too. Some, no doubt, witnessed to me, but it was clear that there was something going on in their lives that was not going on in mine. I'd see them coming back from church on Sunday morning. They walked across the campus quad there. It wasn't a quad, I guess it was the campus from Trinity Lutheran. And I was always able to get first in line for lunch because, I didn't go to church. But then, I thought, I just realized that there was just something else that they had going on that I didn't have going on. And so it was very powerful, that kind of, that just, their sometimes unspoken witness, but it all came together, obviously.
Yeah.
How did that change your family? Like your parents, were your parents still alive at the time? And did they come to faith? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, thanks. A couple years after I went to Winfield, my younger sister went to St. John's too, and then she was baptized and confirmed. We so that she wouldn't have to go through confirmation instruction by herself, my mom went along with her, and then she decided that she would join the church. And then a couple older brothers also, just sort of slowly, one by one. I was back in Colorado for graduate school after seminary, and I was assistant pastor at Wheat Ridge Lutheran Church. And I had my own father in confirmation instruction. You hear stories sometimes about preachers' kids in confirmation, right? How troublesome they can be. Well, try having your own dad as your confirmand. It was nothing but trouble. But anyway, so I think about that, and I think about them all becoming members of the church. But I think now my parents, who are part of the church triumphant in the nearer presence of Jesus, and who do I have to thank for that? I thank St. John's College. I thank the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, of course. That was the parent of that school. This was the church that the Lord used to bring my family to faith, and it's just very powerful for me.
It's very powerful, and I'm a third generation LCMS pastor, and there's benefits, obviously, being raised in a home where there's not been a day, because baptized as an infant when I didn't know the love and mercy and grace by faith in Jesus, but at the same time, I think for a lot of us that have been in the church culture for a while, in the institution, you can kind of lose that missional zeal, and you live in this kind of Christian ghetto, and like everyone around you is Christian. And then as your time as a president, then Pat, and working with a lot of kids, heaven knows that not all the kids that go, I played at Concordia University, Seward, Nebraska, and not all of them are followers of Jesus. They come there for a variety of reasons. So how did your story kind of shape your leadership at the Concordias?
Well, that's a very important question, and you can probably will gather kind of the direction that led me. But I was always kind of felt like I had to respond to those who would say, our Lutheran colleges or high schools or grade schools, those ought to be for Lutheran kids. You need to have Lutheran faculty for Lutheran kids. And I'm all for reinforcing and strengthening our young people in their faith, their catechetical faith, But we had a lot of students, like you said, come to us from all around the country, all over the world. They came to Concordia because they wanted to play college basketball or football, like you, or they wanted to study physical therapy or pharmacy, or who knows why they came, but they came, and we had the opportunity then to much like my St. John's experience, I hope, introduce them to Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life. They couldn't very well avoid him on our campus, and so I think of our schools as being really John Nunes, who had been the president at Concordia Bronxville, often described our schools as the tip of the spear with regard to missions. And we're really that way. And so I'll be the last person to say that our schools ought to be only for Lutheran kids. And then there's this criticism sometimes too that, the percentage of Lutheran students has decreased so much. I can tell you this, at Concordia, Wisconsin, and Ann Arbor, the raw number, the number of Lutheran students did not change in the quarter century that I was president. It went down very little. Certainly much less than the decline and shrinkage of our church body overall, But the overall number of students increased so much, and so I think that's something to really celebrate and to be grateful for, that mission opportunity. And every year we had students whose stories were not that different from mine. Students who were baptized in chapel, brought to faith, who that Concordia was a vehicle of the Spirit in their experience too.
So good. Leading an institution is a hard. I mean, leading the local church, and Jack and I doing our local thing and trying to bless the local church. We truly believe that, everything rises and falls on leaders transformed by the power of the Spirit, specifically pastors and other leaders within the church having the heart and mind of Christ, and then shaping the future of the local church to go on mission. But leading an institution, a couple Concordias, that's a challenging thing. And I'm very, very honored that you would even speak with us today. These kind of guys that just roll in the local church. So I'm not trying to butter you up at all. I really appreciate who you are and how you've led. So what for a leader, say they're 30 years old, maybe 40, somewhere in there, and they're like, man, I got 20, 30 more years of leadership. What principles, values helped you lead so well for so many years?
I was 38 years old when I became the president of Concordia, Wisconsin. 38 years old. I taught history for 6 years. And there were several candidates or 5 finalists, and didn't think for a moment that I would be selected. I just wasn't anticipating that at all. In the meantime, I'd had a call actually down here to Texas, to Concordia Austin, to be the academic vice president. It seemed like a much more natural sort of progression. Even that seemed a bit of a reach. But and Texas is really nice in the wintertime, like Phoenix, right? So that seemed like this is what the Lord wants. But we were very surprised when I was chosen. And of course, I stepped into it with very little leadership experience, and certainly a very underdeveloped kind of theory of leadership. I didn't study leadership. I studied history, which is a good tutorial, I think, in many ways. Very, very happy to have that background. But one of the things that really, of necessity, shaped me from the very beginning was the recognition of my own dearth of ability and experience and skill. And maybe even though it was a really bad team, I learned a lot from sport that that team is a good thing, and you don't have to be. You can't be all things to all people. And as Concordia grew in its numbers and its complexity, and it really became a very, not complicated, but complex organization with 2 residential campuses finally, and thousands of students and very strong academic programs with very talented people, faculty members. It was never kind of false humility for me. Sometimes leaders struggle from false bravado, but for me, it was never a matter of kind of false humility. I was just really humbled to be in that situation. But I knew that it was really critical for me to have a great team that brought skills and abilities and insights and perspectives that never would have occurred to me, not in a million years. And then to listen to them and then to try and build cohesion. And I suppose in some ways that's kind of like a general manager, what the Broncos general manager should be doing, and it's not happening. But build a team. You bring in the right people in the right place. So that was very important, and it was okay for me to acknowledge that, and I think people actually appreciate that, and they appreciate the fact that you don't feel like you have to know all the answers to every question. Now, also, Tim and Jack too, I would say that it's also clear. You don't have to be a student of history to know this, but it's also clear that there are lots of different leadership styles and approaches, and lots of them work, right? They don't. There's not one way to do it, and so I think it really requires some self-awareness, some self-reflection that allows a person to say, this is what I do well, and this is where I can help the most, and then to try and reinforce where there's where there's areas of need to bring others to assist with. And that may be volunteers in smaller organizations, or professionally capable people in larger ones.
Wow. So Pat, how would you recommend for a leader to become more self-aware? Because I believe firmly that's something that can be developed in somebody. But what would you say that process might look like? Some helpful tips for people.
So again, this is not an area of expertise for me. I can only describe what works for me, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, well, I journal for one thing, and I have behind me here volumes and volumes of journals, which is again partly therapeutic and partly just the sense of kind of capturing history. If it's not documented, it's just gone, right? It's gone forever. So mostly familial and other things like that. But self-aware, just what am I thinking? What's going on in my mind? How am I approaching these questions? I mentioned to you both beforehand that I'm a runner. That's also has been a great blessing for me in terms of self-awareness. First of all, it helped me to appreciate and to know how very human I am, and that you can't do what you'd like to do or what you used to be able to do. Even it kind of humbles you into reality. But there's also time just to just be thinking about things, and while usually when I'm running, I'm thinking about running. Nevertheless, it's still, that's part of awareness of my who I am, my being, my body, and thinking intentionally about how to grow mind, body, spirit. Those are a couple things that have helped me. Just engaging in those kind of intentional activities that have caused me to be more self-aware.
Yeah,
I'm sure there are people who could tell you really great, real things, but those are the things that have worked for me.
I think great self-awareness flows from consistent self-care rhythms. And that's what I hear you. That's what I hear you talking about: journaling and movement, and just care for the body, so that our minds can be sharp and we can have a right view of ourselves. Right, not too high, not too low, but the right view of ourselves. And out of that, to go back to your kind of two key leadership principles, which I resonate and 100% endorse, is humility and team. A recognition of who I am and who I'm not, and how we need diverse. It's all 1 Corinthians 12, Romans chapter 12, diverse gifts within the wider body of Christ, or else we're going to really be a wreck. We're going to mess this thing up. We're going to move into pride, which is a leadership killer, or we're going to lead into radical insecurity, which our pride often masks our insecurity. And so just leading with, I never want to forget what it was like to be a 31-year-old called to be a lead pastor at a church in a school down here. And you never want to forget what it was like to be placed in that role at 38. That just breeds that humility and that desperate need for Jesus to show up and show off, and obviously for the body of Christ to do its thing. Anything else to add there, Pat?
Well, you said it very well. I think that the warnings that you offered are ones that also really resonate right now. That pride and insecurity. There's just so much evidence of that, and I say that with humility and with charity, because it's an inclination for all of us, for every one of us, to be susceptible to those kinds of things. But you can see the ugliness that it breeds, and we've got to be on our toes about that.
Yeah. So, hey, Pat, I am over the moon grateful that you have said yes in this season of life. You could be doing a lot of things, having retired from Concordia, Wisconsin, and Ann Arbor there, but you're saying yes to be a part of the LCMS presidential conversation. Praise be to God. If you want to hear more about Pat, you can go to patferry.com. We'll say it again at the end, but patferry.com. You'll be able to share a little bit. You've written some beautiful things there about your future hopes for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. But what's your vision for changing the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod? What do we need to hold on to, and what do we need to release? Yeah,
and I think to your point about this is certainly not something that I had on my radar, right? It was, it's not something that I have aspired to. Folks have raised concern about, well, is this the man seeking the office rather than the man? And anybody who knows me would not have that concern. That's certainly not the case. That being said, folks have asked me and felt led to be a part of the process, and in a way that's, I think, unambiguous, right? It's, instead of saying, for example, that I'll let my name stand, I'm saying I'm running. I'm a runner. Well, I'm running. So I'm running, which is meant to say that this is a political process to some extent. I don't mean that in the kind of negative use of the term. I mean, we have elections, we have, we have delegates, we have all of those things that are part of a political process. And so it's just important for folks to know that I'm willing to do this if this is what the Lord has in mind. I'm not necessarily concerned about winning. I think in some ways, winning would be much worse than losing. If losing means that I get to be retired and hang around my grandchildren, and that's appealing, right? But I think that we need a change in our church, a change of tone, a change of culture. We need to be driven by our hopes and not by our fears. And my fear is that we are not being driven by our hopes, but more by our fears. And of course, Tim, a lot of this comes from experience, right? It's frustration, perhaps the instigator for consideration of this. But in the end, that's not a good reason to run. You run because you believe in a hopeful future, one where I think together we can do so much more and so much better than has been our experience. I'm concerned about, there's so much anger in our culture and so much polarization that has kind of carried over into our church life. And that you mentioned Corinthians before, that the same kind of factionalism that caused the church to say, I'll follow Paul, I'll follow Apollos, I'll follow Cephas, I'll follow Jesus. That's a sort of a natural inclination for all of us anyways, to join up with this group as opposed to that group. And I'd like us to have a future where we recognize that in our church, which, by the way, the differences among us are microscopic compared to what's going on all around it. We just blow them way out of proportion. But a church where we can recognize that we need all kinds of churches to reach all kinds of people, right? St. Paul said, I've become all things to all people so that I might by all means save some. We need that. And that we need churches to say, to have each other's backs as brothers and sisters, rather than kind of stabbing each other in the back all the time when folks are not looking. Just that, and I fear that is our culture. That's the culture that we've allowed to occur. I'm concerned about our shrinkage, and I mean, our numbers have diminished exponentially, and we seem to sort of settle for that, like this is just a demographic reality. The
selling property, right?
Yeah.
Well, we'll just sustain ourselves by selling off properties.
Well, and again, the harvest is plentiful, right? It's as plentiful as it's ever been,
right.
and the Spirit is as powerful as ever. And maybe we are dealing with some demographic challenges. Surely we are, no question about it. But to allow that to be the defining character, no way. The defining character ought to be evangelistic thrust and a strong culture for outreach. That I don't know. I mean, when I was a young college student, it seemed like in the Missouri Synod we talked a lot about evangelism. We had great commission convocations. You had Oswald Hoffman going all over the place. And Billy Graham was saying, when it came to outreach, that the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod was the sleeping giant. And now I think we're just sleeping. We're asleep at the wheel. And it's just very, I mean, that's something that I think is important for us to emphasize. I think education obviously is a strength of mine. Experientially, we're seeing all kinds of challenges in the Concordia University system that shouldn't be there. This didn't have to happen the way that it has happened. Our schools ought to be championed and encouraged, again, as that tip of the mission spear, and instead they become kind of focus of the sharpest of criticisms, and most of them entirely unfair. And what's true for our colleges and universities, by the way, our high schools, our grade schools. I mean, we have people coming to us from all over our communities that we have an opportunity to reach with the gospel. And then finally, I'd say one more thing about things that I would envision. These are points that I've been trying to emphasize. It's been hard for church workers, coming out of COVID. Churches are shrinking in many places. And isn't that ironic? Yet we're still having trouble finding enough church workers for a church that is in precipitous decline. We still can't meet even our own needs. Why is that? Why is it that young people, sons and daughters, are not going into church work, and grandparents are worrying? Why is it that they're not even coming to church? Why is it that they are concerned about their children, their grandchildren? And I think a lot of it goes back to culture then too. So our young people are becoming well aware of what we're against, right? Oh, we know what that church is against. And there are some things that from a principled perspective that we certainly need to take a stand on. But that's not the essence of the church, right? The essence of the church is who we're for, or better said, who's the one who's for us. Mm-hmm. And that if they're not hearing from us about the love of God in Christ for all people, in all places, then they're not hearing what's at the heart of the church's message. And that's the gospel. And so I hope that doesn't change. Guess what shouldn't change? I mean, we've got a strong theology, right? We've got a strong theology, but it's a winsome theology. It's a winsome, and that we might by all means win some. And just this last point on this, I would interview every pre-sem student before he went to the seminary, and I would ask him, what he felt were the collective strengths and relative weaknesses of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod. And I could tell you, like 99% of them said the same thing, maybe 95. But so they said the same thing, that our theology is strong, but we're kind of weak on reaching out to others. And I mean, that's self-awareness, right? That's collective self-awareness. So
Pat, this is, I love this, and you would know this is you're such a history guy. This is something I recently learned going through school. The history of Lutherans. What were they called before they were called Lutherans? They were called evangelicals. That's what they were called, right? And then later the term Lutheran came on. And I think that's what we need to we need to look at our history about that evangelical passion that exists and really embrace even the label evangelical, knowing that it's different than how other people might think of that word, but really understand what is the culture, what is the value behind that word evangelical. It's gospel-y. Everything has got to be gospel-y. It's about sharing the gospel. It's about living in that promise that Christ has given us. So share a little bit about that, because you've got that historical background. What does the church learn, either from the long past or the short past, about how culture could be different in the future?
Yeah, that's interesting. Obviously, terms like that are sometimes loaded, and evangelical brings with it lots of baggage. But and even Lutheran did for Luther at first, right? He was very uncomfortable with that, and I get really uncomfortable too when sometimes we juxtapose Lutheran as if it were in some kind of contrarian position to Christian, right? What's wrong with Christian? That turned the world upside down, and people are away. So, but I think we have to be really thoughtful about that Lutheran identity can become rather sectarian if we're not careful about that we don't see ourselves as part of something much larger, the una sancta, the one holy Christian and apostolic church. And I was always very, very emphatic about how Concordia was the church's school, that we're a Lutheran university, right? But to be Lutheran, I think, is to engage the world, the world in meaningful discussion, to be respectful about other people and to learn from them and their perspectives. And then by developing relationship, to have opportunity to share what is really at the very center of what's important to us. And those themes, by the way, are the heart of the Christian faith, where it beats strongest, right? Faith alone, grace alone, Scripture alone, Christ alone. Those sola themes of the Reformation. It's beautiful stuff. It's beautiful stuff, and it's those are the messages that we preach and teach, and through which we reach others as well. So labels are tricky, but I think it's perfectly fine to emphasize our rich history and heritage. We stand on the shoulders of giants, for sure, but they would not have us only looking back and trying to preserve sort of these icons of the past, but to say, take what is good and reach out in a completely different world than the one that they might have encountered.
Yeah. And for many decades, the LCMS Church was a model of innovation. They invented radio evangelism. Right?
Walter Meyer, unbelievable. We've been working hard at Concordia Ann Arbor to pay special tribute to him for that. So absolutely. And what was, again, the thrust? It was evangelism, right?
Yep.
It was that we wanted to reach the world.
Right.
Yeah. That's so good. There appears to be a misunderstanding. I think it's bad theology that the church leadership exists to defend the gospel and always be prepared to give a reason for the hope that you have within you and always point it back to Jesus. And yet the gates of hell won't stand up against the offensive movement of the gospel. And I think sometimes, Pat, we discount, it's a Father, it's a Son and his work, and then it's don't talk too much about the Holy Spirit, who calls, gathers, enlightens, and sanctifies the entire Christian church here on earth and in heaven. Like we fail to understand that the Holy Spirit is on the move, offensively creating and sustaining faith. And I think one of the major cultural problems for us is we've been playing defense for far too long. We've been still living with the residue, I think, of, and for those of you who are outside the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, we had a seminary split, an infamous walkout, a battle over the Bible, and kind of the higher critical method. And so since then, we've got this long memory, I think, a generation and a half or so of kind of playing defense to defend the scriptures, the inerrant, infallible, inspired word of God. Can you speak to that kind of, and I think it's a balancing effect, because we're not going to give up defending the scriptures. That's not what we're saying, right. But we become imbalanced in that direction. Is that fair?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And I think it just goes back to this very simple cultural perspective. Fear or hope, right? Are we afraid? Are we afraid that we're going to lose our colleges and universities to secular influences? Are we afraid that we're going to lose our Lutheran identity? I'm not afraid of those things. I think that, in fact, if we're not more fully engaged in the culture around us, then we're missing our mission, and we're missing our purpose. We're missing our reason for being, if we're not fully engaged in the midst of that, and rather than sort of creating this very safe or enclave that would keep us separate from it. I'm really concerned about that. You can see why people will do that. They look for safe places, but the Benedict option, like the book that we'd like to create these safe sanctuaries for ourselves and our family. But the church has to be in the midst of the culture. It's very telling, isn't it, that our Lutheran Church Missouri Synod is one of the 2 or 3 most homogeneous church bodies in the country. And by the way, the ELCA is also, so it's not a matter of conservative or progressive theology. It's a matter of culture. It's a matter of perspective. And to the extent that we do not reflect the whole Christian church on earth, that ought to cause us to think very carefully and seriously about what we're not doing well. And you can sort of write off and say, well, the Lord has called us to this kind of ministry. To just reach out to people of Germanic heritage in the Midwest? I mean, good grief, you think about it from, again, a higher ed, sorry to keep leaning on that, but think about that. We lost our only historic black college. We lost our presence in New York City, the cockpit of the world. We lost our presence in the Pacific Northwest, arguably as unchurched an area as anywhere in the country. And why? So that we can maintain this kind of Midwest. It didn't have to happen, frankly. It just didn't have to happen that way. But the more, again, following Luther, we curve in on ourselves, the more we're missing the reason for our being.
Where there is hope, right? Faith gives us that hope, and where there is hope, there should be a shocking abundance of courage that goes along with that.
Yeah, right.
And no fear whatsoever. And that fear that we have, that's our sin, right? And so when church leaders are acting out of fear, this is a hard thing. They're acting out of sin.
Well, this kind of response is, don't be afraid to be Lutheran. Well, that's I would agree. I would agree. But let's think about that in all of its fullness, and that is a very strong gospel thrust.
Yeah. I think that some of the divide right now, and I agree with you, the spectrum of division is theologically is very, very minuscule. I think the divide is maybe more sociological, and we become over time more protective, maybe introverted, intellectual, stoic. You've got some of our European Germanic roots there. And so for those of us, like I'm an extrovert, kind of an entrepreneur, dreaming up new things. For those of us that have that sort of a bent, and want to start new churches to reach new people, that somehow that is labeled as progressive or liberal. Whereas no, I'm just an extrovert that loves to talk about Jesus and loves our deep theology. Do you think that some of our division is more sociological and even the personality of our synod rather than even deeply theological, Pat?
Oh, I do, for sure. I mean, I think it's all right for us to pay attention to theological implications of practices. Obviously, that's fine. It's also fine for us to kind of hold ourselves and each other accountable. But that's seems to be all that we are concerned about, somehow. And again, we don't begin with putting the best construction on what our brother or sister might be doing in another place. I'm very, very fond of high church liturgical worship. I find that very moving and very compelling, and its richness and it's beautiful. When it's done well, it's wonderful. And I'm also very, very happy in contemporary worship settings where the worship is done wonderfully well and it's Christ-centered and I believe God-pleasing. And I for the life of me, I do not understand and have never understood that great debate. Like this is some sort of either or proposition. It's worship. It's worship, This isn't so that now again, worship can be done poorly, and without thought or without care, without concern. Preaching can be done poorly without thought or without care, concern. Witness all of it can be done poorly. But that's why I think the synod needs to be there as resource to strengthen, to support the whole church, not just some segment of it that you feel like maybe is doing it right.
Yeah,
I think that's really concerning. I mean, our church, again, it's not that the continuum is not that broad. We need to learn to talk to each other.
Absolutely. What do you think the primary responsibility of Synod Inc. is? Say you're president, would love that to be the case. What is the primary responsibility of the synodical office?
Yeah. Okay. So the primary, I think there are many things that should be done, but I think from a practical perspective, there are some things that we can do together that we can't do apart. There are some things that should be a kind of collective effort rather than just an individual effort. So seminaries, colleges and universities, and that's it. I think we still need to find creative ways of doing that work more effectively. But we do that well. We do that together. We resource in ways that hopefully will be beneficial to congregations. But I see Synod as servant and servant leader for sure, but as servant primarily to congregations and to entities in their ministries. How can we be supportive of those things? Is Synod Inc. the watchdog of theology for the whole church? No, it has a role in that for sure. It's the public kind of face of that for the whole church. But I think we just lean on these issues of church discipline and accountability as if that were the only thing that we were there for. When I think it's a role, but it's not the primary role, in my opinion, of what the Synod ought to do. And also, I will say that again, that it's about, if I were in a leadership role, there are a lot of things I don't know about how Synod works, right? But and people sometimes ask me, what would you do? And I say, well, I don't know what I would do. I'd have a lot to learn, but I can tell you what I've done, and that is, I have again brought people to assist me to address those broader questions. Some of them professional, some of them volunteer. And how can I say this? Concordia was a much more complex kind of operation than Synod Inc. I mean, a much larger budget, many more people, many more stakeholders, many more constituent groups inside and outside the church. So that doesn't concern me. What concerns me is your question, and that is, what are we there for? What are we there to try and accomplish? To extend the kingdom of God and to spread the gospel and to help our churches and our schools to be effective.
I love that. And can I offer one, just
Sure.
maybe, and I think you'll agree with this, but vision for church planting and new gospel expressions. Mm-hmm. Like, I'm inspired right now, our district in the Pacific Southwest district, and I'd love maybe talk about this. 100 new starts in 10 years, right?
Right.
And so awesome. Christ Greenfield gets to be a part of, we got a 20 and 20 vision. We'd like 20 new campuses in 20 years. That goes into, a micro church to multi-site kind of expression here in our district. But is there a role, do you think, at the Synod level in saying, hey, this is a big stretch goal for us to reach X amount of people and start X amount of new gospel expressions? Do you think that has any role in the synodical president?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't thought about it in detail, but I think that's exactly getting at the kind of cultural thing that does strike me as critical. Yeah, sure. By all means, let's establish those kinds of goals and work together with districts and to accomplish that. That's very encouraging, and I'm glad to hear that. But again, this is sort of a thing like, this is, I don't have my finger on the pulse of all of that, things that are happening across the districts, but that's very inspiring.
Yeah, the synodical president, I think, works through the district presidents very, very well as the relational arm down into our congregations, right? My district president, fantastic man, love him, trust him, and he knows what we're doing, and he champions the missional heart that we have, and obviously that comes from an extension from the synodical office. Yeah, what else to add there, Pat?
Well, and I think that same thing is true here in Texas. Our district president has very strong passion for what you're describing. I think that it's important, though, that we recognize that that in our church there are some who view outreach and evangelism as simply providing word and sacrament ministry. And if we do this, then folks will come. And word and sacrament ministry is the heart of what pastors do. But people aren't just going to come. I mean, this isn't sociology, right? This is just human relationships, that you've got to be intentional about connecting with people to bring them to the place where the Lord brings his gifts so richly to us. But that doesn't happen just because you do it, right? You build a church and open your doors. If we build it, they will come. Now, you got to be very intentional about what you're trying to accomplish. The Spirit works through us that way, right? The Spirit doesn't lay our gifts to the side or our thoughts about how these things are accomplished. It works in and through us to reach others.
Yeah, that's good. This has been so much fun. Let's tease out one other that could be kind of controversial topic here in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod right now. We're a part of the Luther House of Studies and raising up a lot of bivocational leaders. I don't believe that our congregation or our church body is recognizing the deep need for bivocational leaders. So we're not ordaining in a non-recognized way, but we want to make the case that a number of these men who are being trained should be colloquized. We've made it much easier for those outside of our church body to enter into the colloquy process than for those that are inside. And so that's just one kind of controversial point. But I think it all goes down to the institutions, our Concordias and our seminaries being these amazing locations for higher education. And yet it appears that there's a power struggle with LCMS Inc. I've been at the last two conventions. I'll be at this upcoming one, and man, it was tough. Some of the power struggles, and I think a lot of the presidents feeling like their voices are not individually or collectively heard by the president and presidium, and various decisions can be made kind of around their back behind closed doors. It's not, as I look at that relationship, it certainly is not thick with trust and love and care. So what are your hopes for that relationship, and how our Concordias and LCMS Inc. start to work together in a more functional manner?
Yeah, it's a very important question. And the dysfunction, I think, is palpable. The relationship, the last convention, the committee was established to strengthen. This was the charge, right? To strengthen the relationship between the church and the universities. But the committee that was picked, and I was part of it for a while, interpreted that to mean, how do you strengthen the church's oversight of particularly the theological interests of the colleges and universities? And I don't know, Tim, you probably do a little bit of marriage counseling. You have a couple that comes in, they're struggling with some dysfunction, and the goal is to strengthen the relationship. And your advice is, just do what we say. Just do what he says, right? Just do what he says, and everything will be fine. That'll really go. And obviously I'm way biased in this because I've spent so much time at it. But the reality is, over the course of my career as a college president, the church in convention, right? Let's say it that way. The church in convention sought increasingly to gain control over what happened on the campuses through election of presidents, through election of board members, through prior approval of theology faculty, and through whatever other mechanism it could, in order to ensure theological integrity, right? And I've likened this to this kind of, again, a kind of familial metaphor. So when our colleges were young and just starting, they relied completely on the synod for subsidy and guidance and help. And so you had this, with the one hand, the church is reaching out with support, with the other, with this kind of guidance. Well, over the years, the church wasn't in a position to offer support anymore, right? It just didn't have the financial wherewithal. Schools are growing, right? They're growing up, and there's only one hand left, and this one, no, this is the only one left. So it reaches to grab and to guide, and it's sort of like, adult child now. The schools are grown up, they've matured, they're doing fine, they're doing well, and we have not been able to have an adult conversation with the church because you have this parent who is just adamant on controlling every dimension of what goes on, and it just runs so contrary to what I think would be good governance, which recognizes the local authority of local boards who are well positioned, committed Lutheran Christian people, care about the mission, and to give them more authority and opportunity. Our failure to do that well has cost us 3 campuses and another now that says we're not going to make it if this is the model, and they're seeking a different relationship. There's only one other school that didn't close, by the way, and that was Concordia Ann Arbor.
That's right.
And we did that one differently.
Yeah. Praise God. No, anytime you start to lead out of policy and bylaws and just do it because I say, imagine if I had, like, as a husband or even as a pastor, if I started to lead just because I say so. Don't you remember that covenant you signed, these bylaws that you signed that said, and right now I hear, and it really is unfortunately falling on deaf ears. I hear a lot of the synodical leaders talking a lot about policies and bylaws and the way Synod and Convention has agreed, blah, blah, blah. And what they're missing is relationship. They're missing the I actually want to get to know you, care for you, dream with you. And it is like that overly controlling, overly triangular. I could get into systems theory here.
Sure.
And it's very dysfunctional. In a sense, we're fused to one another, and you've got the institutions and maybe even some churches saying, hey, we want to stay in relationship, but it cannot be a fused relationship,
right.
Or a codependent kind of relationship. This is not healthy for us. Is that fair? Anything else to add there? Yeah.
Sure. The last convention, for example, in it, as I stood at the mic to oppose this, and folks knew that I would, and so I was. So someone got up and called the question before I could speak. It was after like 2 speakers, right?
It was unreal.
So the Synod at the last convention gave authority to the board of directors of Synod and the Concordia University System Board to close or merge or any of its colleges without the approval of the local board of regents.
Unreal.
Or the council of presidents, right? This broader group. So it would have been possible, for example, in recent weeks, for those 2 entities, board of directors of Synod and the Concordia University System Board, to say, let's just say hypothetically, Concordia, Texas, you no longer exist. Or you are now under the authority of Concordia X, right? They could have done it. They had that authority and that ability without even a conversation. So, that doesn't work.
Yeah. So for those that are listening to this that are going to be at Synod and Convention, you may not, and Jack, you've never experienced this, but this was one of the most, egregious kind of displays of the church doing its thing. We spent a lot of time having deep debate about this, and then it got toward the end of the day, and everybody is tired, Jack. We've been doing this thing from 8 to 5 or 6. And before the call to question came, I can't remember who was kind of leading the conversation, whether it was President Harrison or someone else. But he says, it looks like it's yours a days. Does it please the committee or the whole delegation to kind of pause this conversation and bring it back up at a later time? And because everybody was kind of tired, it passed probably 55 to 45, something like that. And then a couple days later, I'm not even joking, with very little context for all of the delegates to understand what was going on, this and I can't remember what resolution it was, 7 whatever, you probably remember, Pat, but it gets brought to the floor like you were just saying, and maybe 1 or 2 conversations come up. I call the question, And then it ends up passing barely, 55-45, something like that. With the delegation had very little context to what they were even voting on. The fact that it was allowed to get to that point so quickly without the context was really, really frustrating for me, and obviously more so for our universities.
I think just in a broader kind of question that again, we have conventions, we have elections, we have politics, right? And often the folks who are most involved in politics of the church, they're engaged. Let's put it that way. But to presume or to say that this church is not divided because we have so much consensus around resolutions is really a reach, isn't it? I mean, it's really a reach, because here you have a third of the congregations didn't even vote for synod president last time. They're disengaged, right? The churches are disengaged. There's apathy. There's indifference. They're saying, what does synod? It doesn't have anything to do with me, and I'll just do my ministry here and mind my own business.
Or deeply frustrated.
Yeah, frustrated. There's no energy. There's apathy. There's indifference. And to pretend that just because you have resolutions passed, with significant majorities at district or synodical conventions, it's just, it's silly. It's just silly. It doesn't represent at all where the pulse of the broader church is. And there we have problems. There we have dysfunction. There we have, you have people who are hungry to participate in meaningful ways, but who are disenfranchised. And the argument say, well, get involved, go to a convention. Anything that, like you said, Tim, anything that's run by bylaws and conventions as your kind of your starting point, that is the reflection.
And what comes around goes around. If we're going to legalistically exercise authority and control through bylaws, that goes both ways. If you think about the local church, the local church is only unified to the synod because we agree on the Lutheran confessions and no other reason. And so the synod could decide that a church is in violation of the confessions, but a church can also decide that the synod is in violation of the confessions if it exercises unhealthy forms of control, dysfunctional forms of control that prevent the local church from raising up leaders and doing evangelical work.
Yeah, it's these are tough things. I mean, really. So we are honest, and we're trying. I think folks are trying. But what I don't like, and one of the reasons all of this is just so, I'd rather not be in it at all, is that we kind of manipulate politics for our ends rather than trying to achieve, good and God-pleasing consensus around issues. We play the game. We play the game, and so frankly, I'd rather not be a part of any of it. One of the things I look forward to in retirement is I never have to go to a convention again, But it's beyond convention. It's just when church politics mimics the cultural politics around us, then it's awful. I'm not going to do that in this process. I'm not going to say negative ad hominem things about anybody. I'm not running against Matt. He's, I've known him a long time. We went to seminary together. I'm running for things that I think are important and positive and necessary. And I pray for him every day. I pray for him every single day. It's a tough job, and I want God to bless him in his leadership role among us, which, may continue another 3 years, right? So we want to pray for him.
Yeah. No, thanks for this time, Pat. And I'm a strong fan, and I really pray that you're able to help shape, whether it's formally or informally. I know it will definitely be informally, the future of our church body. And I'm just praying for unity and relationships, that there would be more curiosity rather than condemnation about people and practices that are slightly different from one another. And I know you'd be the type of leader that would create that kind of a culture, that kind of an environment. And it's out of that kind of safety in the midst of diverse expressions that creative gospel expressions flourish. And in this post-Christian secular culture in which we live, we've got to go back to go forward. We look to the early church, the innovation that moved from the early church and you look to the Reformation church and the innovation that moved forward with the gospel being the catalyst. So yeah, it's an awesome opportunity to spend time with you, Pat. I hope it's not the last time. And again, if people want to follow you and nominate you for president, that you can go to patferry.com. Any other places that people can connect with you, Pat?
Tell you what, I'm around. I'm just sitting around, an old ratired guy. So if you want to send me an email, give me a call. I'm just happy to talk to anybody. And by the way, thank you. This has been just great. And if folks who see things differently want to talk to me, I'll talk to them on their podcast too. I'm absolutely eager to talk to anybody, and I'll present, I think, the same message to whomever I'm speaking.
Man, thanks so much, Pat. Jack, so much fun today. This is Lead Time. Sharing is caring. Please like, subscribe, follow wherever it is. It helps get the word out. And we are setting up a lot of conversations with amazing Lutheran Church Missouri Synod leaders in the coming weeks and months. So please stay tuned. It's a good day. Go and make it a great day. Jesus loves you. We love you too. God bless.
God bless.
Thanks, Pat. Peace.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Lead Time, a podcast of the Unite Leadership Collective. The ULC consults and brings together cohorts of congregations to build the culture, systems, and structures of intentional discipleship multiplication. To go deeper with us, create a free login on uniteleadership.org for access to exclusive materials and resources. Thanks for listening and stay tuned for next week's episode.